My friends, let me begin by asking a question that history itself keeps throwing at us. How many times must great powers repeat the same mistakes before we recognize the pattern? We are witnessing right now in Venezuela the echoes of decisions and strategies that should have been abandoned decades ago. Russia's show of force there is not some unexpected anomaly. It is the logical consequence of U.S. policies that refuse to learn from the past. If you put troops, sanctions, and military threats at the doorstep of another sovereign nation long enough, you should not be surprised when that nation looks elsewhere for protection, alliances, and deterrence. And that is precisely what we see in Venezuela today. Russia's military presence in Venezuela has become one of the most significant developments in global geopolitics. And it is far more than a symbolic gesture of solidarity. It is a calculated move, a deliberate projection of power, and a direct response to years of pressure, sanctions, and attempts by Washington to isolate Caracas. To understand its importance, one must step back and see it not as an isolated event, but as part of a much larger chessboard where every move signals intent, defiance, and warning. When Russian aircraft land in Venezuelan airfields, or when reports circulate of military advisors and defense equipment arriving on Venezuelan soil, the message is unmistakable. Venezuela is no longer standing alone against U.S. aggression. It has powerful allies, and those allies are willing to show their presence openly and unapologetically. Consider the timing. Washington has escalated sanctions, restricted access to global financial markets, and actively supported opposition movements inside Venezuela. Such pressure campaigns are designed to destabilize and force regime change, a strategy tried repeatedly across Latin America. But instead of folding, Venezuela turned outward, strengthening ties with powers like Russia, which has its own long history of pushing back against U.S. influence. This is where the hook lies. For the first time in recent decades, the United States finds itself facing an external power directly embedded in what it once called its own backyard. That alone changes the strategic equation entirely. No longer can U.S. military threats be issued with the assumption of guaranteed dominance. The presence of Russia on Venezuelan soil creates a risk, a hesitation, a moment of recalculation in Washington that was absent before. Russia's show of force also carries psychological weight. It reminds Latin America, and indeed the world, that U.S. influence is not unchallenged. For smaller nations long accustomed to U.S. intervention, the image of Russian military planes landing in Caracas is not just about Venezuela, it is about possibility. It demonstrates that alliances exist beyond Washington's orbit, that alternatives to unilateral dependence on U.S. approval are real and tangible. For Washington, this is deeply unsettling. For Caracas, it is empowering. And for Moscow, it is a masterstroke. With relatively limited resources compared to the vast global U.S. military network, it manages to punch far above its weight by planting a flag in one of the most contested regions of the Western Hemisphere. This presence is not merely symbolic because it shifts the risk calculus. Imagine a scenario in which the United States considers a military strike, a blockade, or some form of direct intervention in Venezuela. Before Russia's involvement, such options may have been viewed as aggressive but feasible. With Russian personnel and equipment on the ground, the consequences become infinitely more dangerous. Suddenly, a confrontation with Venezuela risks becoming a confrontation with Russia itself. That is not a risk any U.S. administration can take lightly, no matter the political rhetoric. And herein lies the deeper hook. Russia has managed to deter U.S. action without firing a shot, simply by being present, simply by signaling that Venezuela's sovereignty is not up for unilateral violation. Economically, too, Russia's role matters. Its presence is a shield against total isolation. By offering military cooperation, energy investment, and trade, Moscow provides Caracas with lifelines that blunt the effectiveness of U.S. sanctions. When sanctions fail to break a country, they expose the limits of U.S. power. And every time the world sees those limits, the perception of American dominance erodes further. Russia understands this well. Every flight into Caracas, every handshake with Venezuelan leaders, every televised military exercise carries an outsized political message. The United States cannot dictate terms uncontested, not even in the hemisphere it long considered its own. This is where the stakes become truly global. Russia's actions in Venezuela are not only about defending an ally, they are about testing the boundaries of U.S. power. How far can Washington be pushed? How much risk is it willing to tolerate before recognizing that the unipolar moment has ended? These are the questions Moscow is forcing onto the global stage, and Venezuela has become the arena where they are played out. For the United States, this is an uncomfortable realization. For Russia, it is an opportunity to expand influence at relatively low cost. For Venezuela, it is a shield, a lifeline, and a signal of independence. And let us not overlook the historical irony here. For decades, the United States placed missiles, troops, and bases around Russia's borders in Eastern Europe, in the Baltics, in Central Asia. It justified these moves as security measures, dismissing Moscow's objections. Now, with Russia in Venezuela, the tables have turned. The same discomfort Washington imposed on others is now being felt within its own sphere of influence. The mirror has been turned, and what it reflects is unsettling. A great power forced to confront its own vulnerability in the very region it once dominated. So, when we talk about Russia's military presence in Venezuela, we are not simply discussing a foreign policy footnote. We are looking at a seismic shift in the balance of power, a reminder that no empire, no matter how powerful, can assume permanent control over the choices of sovereign nations. It is a warning, a deterrent, and above all, a statement that the era of unquestioned U.S. dominance in Latin America is ending. And the most striking part of this story is how it all began not with a battle, not with open war, but with planes landing on a Venezuelan runway, carrying with them the unmistakable message that the world has changed and that the old rules no longer apply. U.S. aggression has always been framed as a tool of control, a way of disciplining nations that dare to step outside the orbit of Washington's economic and political order. But what becomes increasingly clear, and perhaps most ironic, is that these aggressive policies often produce the opposite of what they were designed to achieve. Instead of weakening adversaries, they push them into stronger, more resilient alliances. Instead of isolating governments like Venezuela's, they open the door for powers like Russia and China to enter the stage. The intended punishment becomes a catalyst for resistance, and the effort to tighten control becomes the very reason for its unraveling. That is the trap of overreach. And it is a trap the United States has stepped into again and again. Take Venezuela as a living example. Decades of sanctions, blockades, and political interference were supposed to break the will of the Venezuelan leadership and bring the country back under U.S. influence. Yet what has happened? Caracas has survived, not without hardship, but with enough resilience to endure. The hooks here are striking. A nation meant to be crushed has instead found new lifelines, new partnerships, and new ways to maneuver. U.S. aggression did not isolate Venezuela. It sent it running into the arms of Moscow and Beijing. And now, What could have been a manageable regional dispute has transformed into a global flashpoint, drawing in nuclear powers and reshaping the balance of influence in the Western Hemisphere. Sanctions, often described in sterile language as economic tools, are in reality acts of warfare by other means. They choke off trade, restrict access to medicine, cripple infrastructure, and leave entire populations struggling to survive. The architects of these policies believe that pressure from suffering populations will topple governments and open the door for USD-friendly regimes. But history repeatedly shows that this logic backfires. In Cuba, 60 years of sanctions did not dismantle the government, they hardened it. In Iran, decades of economic warfare produced not collapse, but a determined pivot towards self-sufficiency and alliances with Russia and China. Venezuela follows this same pattern. Aggression breeds defiance. Sanctions drive innovation. Isolation invites alternative networks. And in each case, the United States finds itself facing adversaries not weakened, but stronger, more united, and more determined to resist. What Washington's foreign policy elites often fail to grasp is the symbolic weight of aggression. For every sanction imposed, for every military threat issued, the message across Latin America and the wider world is loud and clear. Align yourself too closely with Washington, and you sacrifice your sovereignty. But if you resist and endure the pain, alternatives exist. Russia offers weapons and energy cooperation. China offers infrastructure and credit. Iran offers fuel and technical support. The more Washington punishes, the more these nations step in to fill the gaps. And with each step, the old image of U.S. dominance fades further into history. The hook here is unmistakable aggression creates the very world Washington fears most. Consider how quickly the narrative shifted. The United States thought sanctions would leave Venezuela isolated, starved of resources, desperate for relief. Instead, Venezuelan oil deals with China expanded. Russian advisors arrived to train its forces. Iranian tankers crossed the ocean, breaking blockades and delivering fuel. What should have been a story of U.S. triumph became a spectacle of defiance, one that other nations watched closely. If Venezuela can survive U.S. punishment by turning outward, why not others? That question is now being asked from Africa to Asia to the Middle East. And there is another layer, one that cuts deeper into the U.S. strategy itself. Aggression assumes that populations will blame their governments for suffering, that sanctions and threats will divide societies and create fertile ground for pro-U.S. opposition. But often the opposite occurs. In Venezuela, people see clearly where the source of their hardships lies, not only in mismanagement at home, but in the relentless external pressure designed to break them. Aggression unites rather than divides. It fosters a sense of national resistance, of standing against a foreign power that seeks domination. Instead of collapsing under U.S. pressure, Venezuela has turned its survival into a point of pride, a rallying cry that strengthens the government's legitimacy. On the global stage, the costs of this backfiring strategy are immense. The U.S. projects itself as the guardian of democracy, yet its aggressive tactics reveal something else, a willingness to undermine sovereignty when it conflicts with its interests. That contradiction is not lost on the world. Each act of aggression erodes the moral authority Washington once claimed. Nations that might have remained neutral or even aligned with the U.S. now reconsider their options, wary of being the next target. In this way, aggression does not secure loyalty, it breeds distrust. It does not expand influence, it contracts it, so the cycle repeats. The more Washington punishes Venezuela, the stronger its ties to Russia, China, and Iran become. The more the U.S. tries to isolate, the more alternatives emerge. The more it threatens, the more it reveals the limits of its own power. And here lies the final hook. What U.S. aggression triggers is not submission, but transformation, a multipolar world where power is diffused, where nations carve out independence, and where the United States, once unchallenged, must contend with the consequences of the very policies it created. When we speak of the risk of direct confrontation, we are not engaging in hypothetical speculation, but in the cold realities of geopolitics. Venezuela, once seen by Washington as a manageable adversary within its hemisphere, has now become the stage where two great powers' interests intersect. The introduction of Russian military assets, advisors, and even whispers of long-range defense systems transforms the Venezuelan crisis from a regional dispute into a potential trigger point between the United States and Russia. And here is the hook that should not be ignored. Every U.S. move in Venezuela now carries the weight of possible escalation with a nuclear armed power, a risk that was not present before. What once might have been calculated as a limited intervention could spiral into a confrontation with global consequences. Consider the strategic dilemma this creates. For decades, the United States has operated in Latin America with relative impunity. Military interventions, covert operations, and regime change efforts, though often resisted, did not carry the prospect of drawing in a rival with equal or greater military capability. Today, that luxury is gone. With Russian presence on Venezuelan soil, Washington must ask itself a dangerous question before acting. Could airstrike, a blockade, or even an expanded covert campaign spark a clash with Moscow? If the answer is yes, then the entire calculus of intervention shifts. The cost of aggression increases, the risks multiply, and the room for error shrinks dramatically. The danger here lies not only in intentional acts of escalation, but in miscalculation. Imagine a scenario where U.S. naval forces enforce a blockade, a Russian vessel challenges it, and a confrontation at sea spirals out of control. Or picture American aircraft shadowing Venezuelan airspace while Russian advisors are on the ground, and a single incident, an intercepted jet, a misfired missile, creates a flashpoint. These are not far-fetched scenarios. They are the exact kinds of incidents that history teaches us can trigger wars no one intended. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 is the most famous example, but the lesson echoes across time. When nuclear powers confront one another in contested zones, the margin for error disappears and the stakes escalate beyond control. The presence of Russia also raises the specter of deterrence by ambiguity. Washington cannot know with certainty how far Moscow is willing to go in defending Caracas. Is Russia's presence symbolic, a limited show of support? Or is it a signal that Moscow is prepared to respond militarily if U.S. aggression escalates? This uncertainty is itself a weapon. By keeping Washington guessing, Russia forces hesitation, slows decision-making, and increases the political cost of military action. And here lies the deeper hook. Even without firing a shot, Russia creates deterrence simply by raising the risks of confrontation high enough to make U.S. planners pause. That pause alone is a shift in global power dynamics. For Venezuela, this dynamic offers both protection and peril. Protection, because Russian presence makes outright U.S. military intervention far less likely. Peril, because Caracas is now a front line in a great power contest, and the risks of miscalculation are magnified on its soil. Venezuelans find themselves living in a nation that could, at any moment, become the spark for a wider conflict. For Moscow, this is a gamble worth taking. It projects influence into the Western Hemisphere at relatively low cost. For Washington, it is a nightmare scenario. The once unquestioned dominance of Latin America is being challenged in ways that carry global consequences. The global community watches with unease. For nations outside the immediate conflict, the lesson is sobering. The era when U.S. military threats were seen as decisive is fading. Instead, the Venezuelan case demonstrates that great power rivalry has returned, and with it, the possibility of escalation that extends far beyond regional disputes. This shifts the psychology of geopolitics. Nations that resist U.S. pressure see a model of survival in Venezuela. Nations that once relied on Washington's guarantees of stability now question their security. And the world as a whole is reminded that the balance of power is fragile, subject to rupture with a single misstep. At the heart of this issue is the question of restraint. Can the United States adapt to a world where its dominance is no longer absolute? Can Russia resist the temptation to overplay its hand in Venezuela, knowing the risks of escalation? And can Venezuela navigate its survival without becoming the spark that lights a fire far beyond its borders? These are the questions that hang in the air, unanswered but urgent. The hook here is sharp. One wrong decision, one careless maneuver could transform Venezuela from a troubled nation into the epicenter of a confrontation the world is not prepared to face. Venezuela's sovereignty and agency are often overlooked in discussions dominated by the rivalry between Washington and Moscow, yet they are central to understanding the current crisis. Too often, analysts describe Caracas as a pawn, a passive stage on which global powers play out their struggle. But this framing misses the deeper reality. Venezuela has made deliberate choices, and those choices reflect a fierce insistence on sovereignty. The hook here is that what many interpret as dependency on Russia is, in fact, a calculated assertion of independence from U.S. control. Rather than succumbing to pressure, Venezuela is actively reshaping its alliances to secure the right to chart its own course. For over a century, U.S. policymakers have treated Latin America as their exclusive sphere of influence, guided by the Monroe Doctrine's shadow. In that framework, nations were expected to comply with Washington's political and economic rules or face consequences ranging from sanctions to coups to military interventions. Venezuela's refusal to obey that pattern is not accidental. It is a deliberate rejection of subordination. By inviting Russian advisors, by deepening economic ties with China, and by forging relationships with nations like Iran, Caracas is declaring sovereignty is not negotiable. This is the voice of a country asserting its agency, even under immense external pressure. It is important to recognize that Venezuela's choices come at enormous cost. Sanctions have devastated its economy, cut off access to global financial systems, and restricted vital imports. Yet instead of capitulating, Caracas has sought out alternative paths. That decision, to resist rather than comply, is itself a powerful exercise of agency. It signals to the world, and especially to other nations under pressure, that there are ways to endure and survive outside the U.S. orbit. And that is precisely why Venezuela matters so much in this global contest. It embodies the idea that small nations can still defy great powers, provided they are willing to pay the price. This assertion of sovereignty is also about more than geopolitics. It is about national pride and historical memory. Venezuela has not forgotten decades of interference in Latin America, from Guatemala to Chile to Nicaragua. Each of those interventions carried the same lesson: sovereignty surrendered is sovereignty rarely regained. The Venezuelan government, aware of that history, understands that survival depends on refusing to bend to Washington's demands. The hook is sharp here. By saying no, Venezuela positions itself not merely as a victim of aggression, but as a symbol of resistance, a rallying point for movements across Latin America that also aspire to independence. There is also an internal dimension to this sovereignty. By choosing to align with Russia and China, the Venezuelan leadership reinforces its legitimacy at home. It projects the image of a government unwilling to compromise national dignity even under siege. That defiance becomes a political resource, strengthening the narrative that Venezuela's hardships are the price of independence rather than the failure of leadership. For Washington, this is infuriating because it undermines the central logic of sanctions that suffering populations will turn against their leaders. Instead, sovereignty becomes a rallying cry, and the very act of resistance legitimizes the government's authority. From a broader perspective, Venezuela's agency also exposes the limits of U.S. dominance. For all the pressure Washington exerts, it cannot force Caracas to abandon its alliances. It cannot prevent Russian planes from landing or Chinese investments from flowing in. It cannot compel Venezuela to return to its orbit without resorting to measures so extreme that they risk global escalation. And that is the hook. By exercising agency, Venezuela reveals the fragility of U.S. power, showing that even a relatively small nation under siege can still carve out space to maneuver on the world stage. This dynamic also carries ripple effects beyond Venezuela. Across Latin America, governments and movements are watching closely. They see a nation that, despite immense hardship, refuses to surrender sovereignty. They see Russian and Chinese involvement not as impositions but as enablers of independence from U.S. control. For them, Venezuela is not just a case study, it is an example. And the longer Caracas holds out, the stronger that example becomes. It feeds a broader shift toward multipolarity, where nations seek multiple partners instead of depending on a single dominant power. Ultimately, Venezuela's sovereignty and agency complicate the simplistic narrative of great power rivalry. This is not merely Russia and the U.S. testing each other's resolve. It is a sovereign nation leveraging global competition to secure its independence. The real story here is not one of helplessness, but of strategy, resilience, and defiance. And the hook that echoes through this entire episode is simple yet powerful. In a world of giants, even a smaller nation can assert its place, provided it refuses to accept the role of pawn and insists on being a player in its own right. The shift toward multipolarity is no longer a distant projection of the future. It is happening before our eyes, and Venezuela has become one of the clearest illustrations of this transformation. For much of the 20th century, the global system was defined by unipolar or bipolar dominance. First, the United States emerged after World War II as the architect of an order built around its corporations, its currency, its military alliances. Then came the Cold War, when Washington and Moscow divided the globe into rival blocs. But after the Soviet collapse, Washington convinced itself that the world had entered a unipolar moment where U.S. dominance was both permanent and unquestionable. The hook today is that Venezuela's story proves that moment has ended. A new order is taking shape, one in which power is distributed across several centers and no single nation can dictate terms to all others. The U.S. has long treated Latin America as a domain where it could act without challenge, imposing trade agreements, orchestrating regime changes, and enforcing compliance with economic orthodoxy. But Russia's involvement in Venezuela, coupled with China's economic outreach, undermines this presumption of uncontested authority. Caracas is not just surviving sanctions, it is actively turning toward new networks that bypass U.S. control. The presence of Russian advisors and Chinese investment illustrates a larger truth multipolarity gives smaller nations more options. They can diversify their partnerships, balance their dependencies, and resist the kind of isolation Washington once easily imposed. The hook here is striking. By creating alternatives, multipolarity weakens the effectiveness of aggression, making sanctions and threats far less decisive than they once were. China's role in this transformation cannot be overstated. Through its Belt and Road Initiative and vast lines of credit, Beijing has established itself as an indispensable partner for nations cut off from Western finance. Venezuela, locked out of U.S.-dominated financial systems, has turned to China for loans, infrastructure projects, and trade. This is not charity, it is strategic. By investing in Latin America, China positions itself as a counterweight to U.S. hegemony in the hemisphere. Russia complements this economic footprint with military and strategic support. Together, they represent two poles of influence that make the global order more complex, more contested, and far less predictable. For Washington, accustomed to acting as the sole decision maker, this is deeply unsettling. What multipolarity changes most is perception. Nations once resigned to U.S. dominance now see that defiance is possible, provided they align with alternative powers. This perception is as powerful as any missile or loan agreement because it shifts the psychology of global politics. Countries under pressure, from Iran to Cuba, from Syria to parts of Africa, are watching Venezuela and drawing conclusions. They see that reliance on U.S. goodwill is no longer the only path to survival, that new avenues of trade, finance, and defense exist outside the American system. The hook is clear. Every time Venezuela resists with the help of Russia or China, it signals to the world that the unipolar era is over and that survival no longer requires submission. The United States, of course, resists this shift fiercely. Its policymakers understand that multipolarity erodes the foundations of their global influence, from the dominance of the dollar to the ability to impose sanctions unilaterally. But resistance does not halt the process. In fact, it accelerates it. Every new sanction forces Venezuela and others to deepen ties with Russia and China. Every threat of intervention justifies further Russian presence in the region. Every attempt at isolation becomes another incentive for countries to create new institutions and systems that reduce dependence on Washington. This is the irony of multipolarity. U.S. aggression, intended to preserve dominance, becomes the very fuel that accelerates its decline. Venezuela's role in this larger drama is not accidental. By embracing alliances outside Washington's orbit, Caracas is both a beneficiary and a driver of multipolarity. Its defiance demonstrates that even a sanctioned, economically pressured nation can leverage the new global balance to survive and even strengthen its position. That is the hook that resonates far beyond Venezuela. The logic of multipolarity is not abstract. It is embodied in nations that refuse to be isolated and instead find lifelines in alternative partnerships. What makes this shift so profound is that it extends into economics, military affairs, and even cultural influence. Oil deals are increasingly settled in currencies other than the dollar. Military cooperation exercises showcase alternatives to NATO's dominance. Media platforms backed by Russia and China challenge the Western narrative. All these elements converge in Venezuela, turning it into a stage where multipolarity is not debated in theory, but enacted in practice, and every step taken there echoes worldwide, eroding the myth of American permanence. The world that is emerging is neither orderly nor stable. Multipolarity brings its own risks: competition, fragmentation, and the danger of confrontation between great powers. But for nations long subjected to the dictates of a single hegemon, it also brings opportunity. It offers bargaining power, choice, and a chance to assert sovereignty in ways that were once impossible. Venezuela embodies this opportunity, standing as proof that no empire can forever command obedience. The hook ultimately is this: Multipolarity is not arriving quietly. It is arriving through confrontation, defiance, and the refusal of nations like Venezuela to bow. And it is rewriting the rules of global politics in real time. When examining the possibility of chain reactions triggered by U.S. aggression toward Venezuela, the most important realization is that we are not dealing with isolated consequences. Each sanction, each threat, each maneuver ripples outward, shaping events not only in Caracas, but across Latin America and even the wider global system. The hook here is that a single act of U.S. aggression can set into motion a series of responses and counter responses that transform a regional dispute into a global reconfiguration of alliances, markets, and military strategies. Venezuela is not a closed case, it is a hinge, and when pressure is applied to it, the entire door of international order swings with unpredictable force. One of the clearest potential chain reactions lies in the deepening of Russian involvement throughout Latin America. If Washington escalates its military posture toward Venezuela, Moscow has every incentive to expand its footprint beyond Caracas. Cuba, with its long history of defiance against U.S. power, becomes a natural candidate for further Russian support. Nicaragua, with its leftist government and strategic location, also stands ready to strengthen ties with Moscow. The pattern is evident. The more aggressively Washington acts, the more Russia spreads its influence across a region long assumed to be America's uncontested backyard. The hook here is sharp. U.S. efforts to contain Russia in Eastern Europe may inadvertently invite its presence in the Western Hemisphere, reviving fears of a modern-day Cuban Missile Crisis. Another chain reaction unfolds in the economic realm. U.S. sanctions have already pushed Venezuela to trade oil and minerals in currencies other than the dollar. Escalating aggression will only accelerate this trend, encouraging not just Venezuela but other nations under pressure to abandon dollar-denominated markets. If Venezuelan oil increasingly flows to China in yuan or to Russia in rubles, the long-standing dominance of the dollar in global energy markets erodes further. This is not just about Venezuela's survival. It is about the credibility of the U.S. financial system itself. And the hook here is that each attempt to strangle an adversary economically could weaken the very currency that underpins U.S. global power. We must also consider the role of China in this chain reaction. Washington's aggression against Venezuela creates opportunities for Beijing to present itself as a reliable partner, one willing to provide loans, infrastructure, and trade routes when Western avenues are blocked. With every new project and every new credit line, China expands its influence in Latin America, creating a network of relationships that weaken U.S. leverage. The more Washington tries to isolate Venezuela, the more Beijing is positioned to step in as the alternative. That substitution effect is not contained. It reverberates across the region, showing other governments that alignment with China can provide insulation against U.S. pressure. The risks extend to military dynamics as well. Should the U.S. take aggressive action against Venezuela, whether through naval blockades, air patrols, or covert operations, Moscow may feel compelled to respond with additional deployments. Russian bombers flying in the Caribbean, naval visits to Venezuelan ports, or even the establishment of permanent military facilities could all follow. And if such moves occur, Washington will almost certainly escalate its own military presence in the region, for that spiral increases the chances of miscalculation, with every new maneuver raising the risk of a direct clash. The hook is undeniable. U.S. aggression in Venezuela could ignite a chain reaction, leading not just to expanded influence, but to dangerous military brinkmanship in America's own hemisphere. Beyond the great powers, there is another layer to these potential chain reactions: the psychological impact across Latin America. Countries long weary of U.S. dominance, Bolivia, Argentina, Mexico, even Brazil under certain governments will observe closely if Venezuela, despite relentless pressure, endures by leaning on Russia and China. Then the lesson spreads. Other nations may seek to diversify their alliances, limit their dependence on Washington, and resist the policies once seen as unavoidable. U.S. aggression meant to impose discipline may instead generate disobedience across the region, accelerating the decline of its hemispheric authority. And finally, there is the most dangerous chain reaction of all, the erosion of restraint. Each escalation reduces the space for diplomacy, increases the stakes, and narrows the options for de-escalation. A blockade here, a sanction there, a military exercise in response, a deployment to counter. It builds momentum that neither side can easily reverse. The world has seen this dynamic before in the years leading to wars that no one wanted but no one could stop. The hook that hangs over Venezuela is chilling. A nation under siege may become the spark that ignites not only regional instability but global confrontation as powers locked in rivalry push one move too far. In the end, what U.S. aggression risks triggering is not a single outcome, but a cascade: economic realignments, military buildups, regional shifts, and global instability. Each act of pressure becomes the starting point for new reactions, multiplying rather than resolving the challenges Washington faces. Venezuela is the stage, but the consequences extend far beyond its borders, reshaping the very structure of international politics. The lesson, if one is willing to see it, is stark aggression is never contained, and when directed at a nation determined to survive with powerful allies at its side, it can unleash waves that reach every shore. Let me close with this thought. Every empire in history believed it could not fall, that its military might guaranteed eternal dominance. And yet every empire has fallen, not simply from external enemies, but from the blindness of its own ruling elites. Russia's show of force in Venezuela is not just a challenge to U.S. power. It is a mirror held up to Washington, asking whether it will learn or whether it will stumble down the same path as empires before it. The world is watching. The stakes are high, and the future, my friends, will be determined not by rhetoric, but by choices made in this very moment.